أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum everyone and welcome to our iTVusa show Balancing Deen and Dunya. My name is Dr. Suzy Ismail from Cornerstone and I'm happy to have you with us again this week as we get to meet inspirational figures in our community, leaders who are trailblazing paths for American Muslims and really changing the way that we see the world and the way that we interact with others. Today, I'm so honored to have with us an amazing woman who is a role model to me personally and to many other women out there, and someone who I am honored and blessed to have gotten to meet many times, and who I consider personally just an incredible person as well. So today, our guest is Sister Dalia Mogahed.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dalia, we are so honored to have you on the guest and so appreciate you accepting the invitation. Before we get started in getting to know you a little bit more, I just want to share with our audience just a snippet of your impressive bio, mashallah. I know that many of our audience members are familiar with you and your work, but for those of you who, those of our audience members who are just joining us or who would like to know a little bit more, Sister Dalia Mogahed is the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. She leads the organization's pioneering research and thought leadership programs on American Muslims. Dalia is a former executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, where she led the analysis of surveys of Muslim communities worldwide. With John L. Esposito, she co-authored the book, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. President Barack Obama had also appointed Dalia to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships in 2009. She was invited to testify before the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations about U.S. engagement with Muslim communities. In 2016, her TED Talk was named one of the top TED Talks that year, and she's a frequent expert commentator on global media outlets and international forums. She's also the CEO of Mogahed Consulting. So I know there's a lot more that I could say, but I'll leave the bio at that and really just welcome you to the show, Dalia. Thank you for being here.
It's absolutely my pleasure, Dr. Suzy. Thank you so much for having me.
No, I'm really excited that you agreed to join because, you know, on this show, we like to explore kind of the personal side of people whom we may see in the public, people we get to know, you know, visually maybe. And I know one of the early moments, I think, of connection that I had with you was not necessarily in person at the conferences or the programs that we're at, but was when you were on the Trevor Noah show. And my family and I and my children, you know, sat around and we watched this show together. And I know my daughters were just fascinated, as was I, you know, kind of fangirling. And I'd love to kind of start maybe with that memory. Tell us a little bit about that experience, you know, what it was like, how you got to that point, and we'll kind of take the journey from there.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was an absolutely exhilarating and terrifying experience. I'll just start by saying that what happened was that, you know, it was in 2016, and it was, you know, sometime in very early 2016, I think it was in January. And during that time, Trump was a presidential candidate and had really made the Muslim community his target and his platform, in fact. So I was suddenly getting quite a bit of media requests. And one of them was from Meet the Press, you know, a program that that is like a news show where there's a conversation, there's an interview with different people. And I went on Meet the Press, and I had made the point on that show that asking Muslims to condemn terrorism was in and of itself, or asking, you know, if they condemn terrorism, or even making that a question at all, was in and of itself an incredibly offensive thing to do, because it should be, you know, it should be assumed that if we're human beings, we are offended by the targeting of women and children. So one of the producers from And so just to back up, I mean, it was also really surprising even to get called for Meet the Press, because it's actually a very hard to get kind of spot. It's really quite prestigious, and I was very surprised to get that call. But the person who had called me said, "Oh, you know, I remember your book," which was like ancient history by then, right? It came out in 2008. So it was like 2016, 8 years before. No one ever, I mean, when you write a book, it's like gone after 3 weeks, like let alone 8 years later. So it was like a miracle that he even thought of me or remembered me. So anyway, I went on that show, and one of the producers from The Daily Show saw me on Meet the Press, and she reached out to me. And that was just a mind-blowing, incredible email and call to get, because it's a very hard, very, very hard thing to get on The Daily Show. And I had no resource. I had no agent, no manager. Nobody was getting me these spots. And when I did have those resources at Gallup, when my book did come out, Who Speaks for Islam with John Esposito, they tried to get us on The Daily Show and failed. So SubhanAllah just kind of like came from the sky. And I was told I would be on in 3 weeks. So that was good. I had time to prepare, and I prepared like crazy. I think people have said that it sounded like like I sounded very spontaneous. It was spontaneous in that it's not like I had a script, not like Trevor and I agreed on what we would say at all. But I was prepared. I had certain things I wanted to say. I had certain, key messages I wanted to get out there. And so in those 3 weeks, I worked with a coach. So that's one thing I actually wanted to emphasize is like, these things require work, a lot of work, dozens of hours of work to make them seem effortless. So I was, blessed enough to have someone help me, sponsored a coach for me to work with. And I did. I worked with her, and I worked with her actually also on my TED Talk. So she was my coach for both. Her name is Judy Carter, and she does coaching, for public speaking and TV and whatever all the time. That's her job, and among other things. But she coached me on The Daily Show, and she's a comedian herself. So she sort of helped me figure out how to do this, what to do, how to say, whatever, just, it wasn't something I was versed in or used to. I'm a researcher. I deal in graphs and numbers and things like that. So it was a totally new kind of area for me. And I remember, prepared as much as I could. My mom was really nervous. She's like, "Oh my God, you're going to talk to a comedian. He's going to make fun of you. It's going to be terrible." And so anyway, it was terrifying to begin with, but my mom made it just that much more exciting. And I took my son. We got on a train from DC to New York City. And The Daily Show, if you're on it, you get I think like 5 free tickets to the show. So I called or emailed, the folks I knew in New York, including Linda Sarsour. So she was in the audience. So it was really nice to have some support and love that I knew at least 5 people were rooting for me. And you get there, and so I went with my son, who was at the time 16 years old, and we were in the green room before the show, extremely nervous, just like jitters and beyond what you can imagine, just so nervous. And then Trevor came in and was talking to us and took pictures with my son. And he said, "So I'm going to be making some jokes." I'm like, "Really? Who knew?" It was so funny how nervous he seemed, honestly, about me being there. Yes. And he's like, "I'm going to be making some jokes, but it's not, to make, it's not to make fun of you or to be prejudiced. It's just, I'm trying to, give you a chance to sort of dispel stereotypes. Yes. That's just how we do it in the show." And I'm like, okay, like I have once or twice.
Yes.
So it was funny that he was kind of not sure if
How
I
to
was going to be completely hard to talk to.
Yeah.
So alhamdulillah, that was kind of the background of how it happened.
I love that behind the scenes glance that we get, because I remember like we were like laughing out loud. Like you said some really funny one-liners, and you know, it did seem like very natural banter. But I think it's such an important point that you make, that what may appear natural to us, you know, when it's televised or mediated, that there are hours and hours of work and preparation that go into that beforehand. Now, the TED Talk that you gave, I remember watching that as well, and you had talked a little bit about the aftermath of September 11th. You had mentioned your son. You know, you really captured kind of the element of what it means to be an American Muslim, you know, and that American part, I think, was the part that was really missing in terms of the Muslim identity. Tell us a little bit about the TED Talk. How did that journey come about, and what was that like for you?
Yeah, I had these two back-to-back incredible, honestly, like the climax of my career. I don't think I'll ever have quite the platform that those two offered within months of each other. So the TED Talk, I think Daily Show was January, and I think the TED Talk was like February or something. I mean, it was very close to it. And the TED Talk, and I just, you know, so TED is, as many know, is a for-profit organization. I think I'm pretty sure it is. And what they do is they have a bunch of different programs, but their sort of like flagship thing is the TED conference in Vancouver. And this is the TED main stage, which is really difficult to get invited to. And I had, you know, I never thought that would be me, right? It's like the people in the audience, as I came to find out, are like movie stars and big tech CEOs, and just very, very intimidating audience. So that was the TED that called me. Again, Trump rhetoric is sort of motivated so much of this, and so subhanallah, Allah uses even evil people for good sometimes. So I got a call from TED, and I kind of didn't know what that meant. I thought it was a TEDx somewhere. I didn't get it. And I was going through a really rough time at the time with my son. And so I was very preoccupied with him and what was going on with him. So I got the call. It was scheduled for like 5 o'clock. The few days later, I completely forgot about it because I was dealing with something having to do with my son. So they called me, and I was supposed to be like it's like basically like a Zoom call with like 5 people, which I totally missed. And anyway, it was a bit of a disaster, but I was like somewhere outside, not even on camera. So anyway, I had this call with them, which started out very bad in that they're like, well, we want you to, you know, talk about something that shows everybody how Muslims are condemning terrorism. Like my favorite like thing to rage about, right? So I kind of went off on them. I was very defensive. They weren't feeling good about it. And then whatever happened, somehow the conversation changed slightly, where I was able to say, what I'd really like to talk about is I want to give people a window into why this faith inspires us. What about it makes us deal with hard things in our lives? Why are we even still holding on to such a huge social liability when there's so much attack against it? And they were sort of like were taken aback by that. And then like this opening where Chris Anderson, the head of TED, the president, who was the one kind of talking about, you know, the condemning terrorism, Muslims should march by the millions and stuff like that. He said, you know, I grew up in Pakistan. And I was like, what? I mean, he's a white British guy. Like, never. He's like, yeah. And that's exactly the experience I had, is people just had this dignity, this compassion that was inexplicable. They were poor, they were impoverished. He lived like in a village somewhere. And his father went under the pretext of being a doctor, but really as a missionary.
Yeah.
And then by the end of their time there, he said, I don't want to convert these people. These people already have something I wish I had. He didn't convert to Islam himself, but he had tremendous respect for Islam by the end of his time in Pakistan. And so then he was like really inspired by this new topic of like, what is it like to be a Muslim? And that's what the topic ended up transforming into, from where it was in a very kind of problematic framing. And so I worked with Judy Carter. Judy is Jewish and a comedian, and she was able to help me frame my message in a way that would land the way I would want it to land. So there's a difference between, you know, as I'm sure you know, Dr. Suzy, there's a difference in communication between what we say and what people hear. Sometimes there's this huge gap. And so talking, and people are hearing something completely different from our intent. And so what she was able to help me do is to close that gap a little bit more than maybe I would have. And she came up with sort of the idea of, which I thought worked really well, and I'm giving her credit, but split the story up, where the story starts in the beginning about going to the mosque on you know, the week of 9/11, then ends at the end, you know, so people are sort of like waiting to find out what happens, but there's all this stuff in the middle that you have to tell them, and then you end with so it sort of wraps the whole speech. And I thought that was really brilliant. And the other thing she recommended, which was terrifying for me, is she said, you just have to acknowledge that everyone's freaking out about the way you look.
Yes.
You have to just address it head on. Like, you can't just like pretend it's not there. And so she's like, you need to just go on stage, and this is terrifying to do, terrifying, and say, what do you think when you look at me? Like, just like get them right there, direct, like be very direct, and like speak to what they're thinking at that moment. So that was really scary and very out of my comfort zone. My talks are very, you know, just usually about data. Like, they're not this incredible, vulnerable, personal thing that I'm doing. And so it was really, really something I had to kind of lean into. And that speech had to be memorized. It's 15 minutes of memorized prose. I mean, you can imagine, it's like memorizing Surat Yasin. So it's not like a trivial task at all. And I was changing it on the plane to Vancouver. I was I'm so meticulous and such a perfectionist. But anyway, so I put it together in sort of like a rough draft form. And the TED people are very like hands-on. Like, they don't just be like, come to TED, and then they're surprised by what you know. It's like
they know.
They're finding out what your drafts are, what you're saying, and coaching you, and you know, stuff like that. So they were going to do a check-in with me on what I was going to be. And this is before I had it memorized, but I had the text. So I basically delivered the speech to them over like a Zoom call. Alhamdulillah, I made that meeting. I didn't miss it.
I'm so glad.
And they were like speechless. They were absolutely floored. And they said it was amazing. I was so happy. So that gave me like a lot more you know, reassurance and confidence. And I continued to work on it. And I flew to Vancouver. I remember being just, I'm always so nauseous and so scared and so nervous. And so I got there and I still didn't really know what I was getting into. I just didn't quite get it until I got there and I saw who else was speaking and then who was in the audience. And it was beyond terrifying. I mean, I actually saw Harrison Ford in the audience.
That's quite a person to see.
I grew up, you know,
Indiana Jones.
I'm like, oh my God, Dr. Jones is here. What am I going to do?
Exactly what I would think. Yep.
It was like that. And, you know, Steven Spielberg was there and the CEO of Twitter at the time, obviously not Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And all these just famous people and very powerful people. And that's who's in the audience in a main stage TED conference. That's part of the reason it's so terrifying and so hard to be able to go. And then the other speakers were also just very prominent people. I was I was in the same session as Shonda Rhimes. I don't know. People don't know her name. You need to look it up.
Bridgerton. That's the
yes, and Grey's Anatomy and Scandal and Murder. How to Get Away with Murder and so many other shows that everyone watches. And she wrote them. Like she is this giant in the business. Anyway, so I was sharing a stage with her, and it was like, oh my God, what am I doing here? So I had to do a rehearsal when I got there. And I arrived like Sunday night. Monday was the rehearsal and I was going to be speaking on Thursday. So, you know, the sessions are like each day and I was scheduled then. And my rehearsal was horrible. Oh, horrible. I mean, it was weird because I was like doing my dress rehearsal. People were talking and I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't remember my lines. I couldn't remember my speech. Yeah. And it was just so demoralizing. So I went back to my hotel room and I just practiced. I basically missed the I didn't even like,
SubhanAllah, you
before
focus.
you speak, you can't attend anything. You're just like
focusing on it.
Yeah. And I did that in my hotel room. My friend who lives in Vancouver was there as my one, you know, audience of one helping me. And God bless her, Dr. Hela Ahmed. And I still didn't feel like I had it down, you know, by that morning when I was going to be speaking. I was still, and I just, and I just sort of broke down and just cried and cried. I cried for like an hour before I was going to go because I felt so like ill-prepared.
SubhanAllah.
And I'm just like,
SubhanAllah.
This is on you. I can't even, this isn't, I don't have this together. And I always feel this sense of responsibility, like you know, I have this opportunity. This is an antenna, and how am I fulfilling it? Yes. So I went to, so I went to the place, the conference center. Yeah. Very, very, I mean, I can't even describe how beautiful this place is, but Vancouver is one of the most beautiful places in the world. And the conference center is on the water with like these majestic mountains everywhere around. And then everything's just window, like ceiling, floor to ceiling window. So you're just looking out on water and mountains. It's so beautiful, but it reminded me of how dwarfed I am and how big Allah is. And SubhanAllah, it was so helpful to calm me down to see that. And so I was backstage and I was waiting to go up, and I looked around and saw who was in the audience, and I was like, okay, there's no way to impress these people. Like, I can't be up here trying to be impressive. I have to have a different goal. And when I read the Dawah of Musa, you know, it was like I had never heard it before. I say it all the time, obviously, everyone does when we're speaking. But that moment, it was like I'd never heard it before. It was like I was hearing it for the first time. Because what he says in his dua, says, Rabbi shrah li sadri. My chest was like,
Subhanallah, yes.
I was like,
sure.
okay, step one, Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri, because it's difficult. Wahlul 'uqda min lisani yafqahu qawli. So expand my chest, because your chest is so constricted when you're nervous like that.
Yes. Yeah.
Shrah li sadri, and ease my task.
Yes.
And untie my tongue so that
they may understand.
Not so that I can impress them, sound eloquent, you know, any of that. They can't be about me.
Yeah.
And
that's
so
such a beautiful way of looking at it, Dalia. And I think, you know, I love hearing the personal backstory, because so many of us, you know you for who we see on TV, for who we see leading lectures. And I will tell you honestly, this is probably a note that you don't know, but back in 2009, I think it was, I was sitting actually with my family, and we saw on the television, you were standing behind Barack Obama, I think at the time, or it was during your White House time. And I remember my parents were so proud of you, my parents who you don't know. And my parents sitting there were, you know, me and my sisters were all there, and they were saying, oh, if only we could see you guys in a position like this young Muslim woman wearing hijab. And I think, you know, sometimes when you're in that light, you know, you don't realize how you're inspiring so many people, you know, people that you don't even know, you know, almost 15 years ago or so, you know. And I remember at that moment I had looked you up, and I realized that John Esposito was one of the authors that I had read throughout my Islam classes in my undergrad years. And again, I didn't know you, we had never met, we had never talked, but I remember following your career from that point forward, because you had inspired me. And I think by sharing today with our audience members your journey and how, you know, it doesn't come easy to be in that position sometimes where people look to you to understand, people look to you to get answers, and how, you know, as much as it may seem glamorous, you know, there's a lot that goes into it. I mean, you crying in the hotel room before going to give the TED Talk, that broke my heart, but it also really humanized you, you know, for all the times that, you know, every one of us has spent crying before taking on a task that we know Allah Azza wa Jal has written for us, but that we're terrified of doing. It means so much to know that someone who's a role model to so many goes through that too. So thank you for sharing that with us. So Dalia, in the last few minutes that we have together in the show, there's a question that we like to ask all of our guests. And it is a little bit personal, but it helps us better understand, you know, your journey and, you know, how you've gotten from, you know, where you were to where you are today. And it relates to finding balance, you know, being in a place where you are trying to best represent the deen, you're trying to incorporate the deen in everything you do, but also living in a dunya that is very secular, that can be very cutthroat, that is difficult sometimes to etch a pathway of deen. How do you do it? How do you find that balance between deen and dunya in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the way I think about it is that almost instead of a balance, I think of it truly as the model that's sort of always in my mind is one fuels the other, or at least that's what I strive for. What I mean by that is my work throughout my career has in many cases been in very challenging environments. I now work at ISPU, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, and it's by far the best place I've ever worked. Environment is beautiful, but that's the exception. So most of my career, the environment was very challenging for various reasons. And the only way I could function and not give up and not feel, you know, overwhelmed or you know, give into sort of a sense of defeatism or despair is by harnessing my deen. So It was the engine behind my dunya engagement. How I show up in the dunya is all animated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in my life. And the thing is, I don't even see this as like, I'm not saying this like this is a virtue of mine. I cannot imagine doing it without that. I don't understand how anyone can make it through this place, this mile, you know, this like this war zone. And I'm not just talking about actual war zones, but this place we call the dunya with so much suffering and so much injustice and so much to make us lose hope. How do you go through that without God? I cannot imagine. So for me, it's like, I am so grateful for having been blessed with the knowledge of Allah and the proper relationship to Him through Islam, because it helps. It doesn't help. It is essential and critical, and it is the most basic requirement of showing up as a human being in a place, in an environment that wants to strip you of that humanity in every way it can.
SubhanAllah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Jazakallahu khair, Sister Dalia Mogahed, for being on our show today and sharing just an incredibly personal and vulnerable side of you that I know our viewers are going to gain so much benefit from. For those of you who are just joining our episode now, we've had an incredible time learning quite a bit about Sister Dalia Mogahed, the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, who really charted for us her journey, whether it was on the Trevor Noah show or giving a TED Talk, and her experiences as a mother, as a public figure well known in the community, as someone who was asked to represent Islam at times when it was very difficult. And we really appreciate having you with us on the show. And I hope our viewers will continue to tune in to iTVusa show, Balancing Deen and Dunya. Jazakum Allahu khair. Wassalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.